Hello and welcome to this episode of Mrs. Mulvey's Math Movies. In this episode, we're going to talk about logic and conditional statements. So we have some vocabulary to go over first. And in order to understand this lesson, you need to understand what a conditional statement is. A conditional statement is simply a logical statement that has both a hypothesis and a conclusion. And so we're going to work on identifying conditional statements. We're going to take a look at identifying the different parts of conditional statements. And we're going to take a look at the converse of conditional statements. So right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you an example of a conditional statement. Here is a conditional statement. If SpongeBob is making Krabby Patties, then he is happy. So if you notice, there are two parts to this statement. There's the part behind the if, and there's the part behind the then. And because the part of the then is based on the if, it's conditional upon the if part, this is a conditional statement. So one way you can identify a conditional statement is if it has the if and the then. Now there may be conditional statements that don't have both of those words, and we're going to take a look at those later. But right now an easy way to identify the conditional is the if and the then part. So the part that goes with the if, the part that's behind the if, that's called the hypothesis. So if this condition is in place, SpongeBob is making Krabby Patties, that part of the conditional statement is called the hypothesis. It's the if part. The conclusion is what follows the word then. It's the then part. Then this is going to happen. So notice, let me just get that a little bit more neat. There we go. There's an if part and there's a then part. The then part is conditionally based upon the if part happening. So if SpongeBob is making Krabby Patties, then he is happy, is a statement. There's the hypothesis and there's the conclusion. Let's take a look at another conditional statement with an if and then. Here's another conditional statement. Notice there's an if part and a then part. What follows the if part is the hypothesis. Notice, the hypothesis is just the part that follows if. The hypothesis does not include the word if. So my hypothesis here would be, you study for 5 hours. The conclusion is what follows the word then. It does not include the word then. The conclusion, I'm going to underline twice, is you will pass the test. So the conditional statement is that if the hypothesis is in place, you study for 5 hours, the conditional then, the conclusion is then that you will pass the test. So the really easy way to identify the hypothesis and the conclusion is that the hypothesis follows the if, the conclusion follows the then. So it's important to note that a conditional statement could be true or it could be false. If a conditional statement is true, or to be considered true, it must always be true. And so in this case, this conditional statement, if you study for 5 hours, then you will pass the test, that doesn't necessarily always have to be true. And so therefore, this conditional statement could be false. But even though it could be a false conditional statement, it's important to know that the hypothesis follows the if and the conclusion follows the then. In order to show that a statement could be false, you would provide a counterexample. For this particular conditional statement, my counterexample will be that I once studied for 5 hours for a test and I didn't pass it. That happened in college. And so once I provide the counterexample, then I know that my conditional is a false statement. Let's take a look at another example. So here's another conditional statement. If it's the middle of the day, then the sun is shining. Notice that there is a hypothesis, the part that follows the if. The hypothesis is it's the middle of the day. And there's a conclusion, the sun is shining. Now the question is, for you that I have, is this a true statement? And while it's true much of the time, there are times when it's not true. We just had a time, August 21st, eclipse of the sun. It was the middle of the day, but the sun was not shining. It was covered up. And so even though this statement is true most of the time, it's not true all of the time. And so my counterexample to prove that this is a false statement is the eclipse. There was an eclipse on August 21st. It covered the entire sun. It was the middle of the day and the sun was not shining. So we have identified conditional statements. We've identified parts of conditional statements, and the last thing on our checklist was to state the converse of conditional statements. So let me define converse for you first. The converse of a conditional statement is when you switch the hypothesis and the conclusion of the conditional statement. So let's take a look at an example. Here's my conditional statement. If Dan drops his geometry book on his foot, then his foot will hurt. It has an if and a then. It's a conditional. This part is the hypothesis. Dan drops his geometry book on his foot. And the part following then is the conclusion. His foot will hurt. So as I said, a converse is when you switch the hypothesis and the conclusion. So if I take this statement and I switch around the hypothesis and conclusion, in other words, I put the conclusion words after the if, and I put the hypothesis words after the then, I've switched the hypothesis and the conclusion, and I end up with a new statement. So this is what it would look like. The converse would be, if his foot hurts, technically it would be if his foot will hurt, or his foot will hurt. I'm going to switch them word for word. Sometimes the wording gets awkward, but I'll switch it word for word. So when I switch the hypothesis and the conclusion, now the new hypothesis is that his foot will hurt, and the new conclusion is Dan drops his geometry book on his foot. Now, like I said, that wording can get awkward. It's okay to change the wording a bit to have it make grammatical sense as long as you don't change the meaning. But technically, the converse, where I switch the hypothesis and the conclusion, would be if his foot will hurt, then Dan drops his geometry book on his foot. But I'd probably change the grammar of that to say if his foot hurts, then Dan drops his geometry book on it. So again, the converse is where you switch the hypothesis and the conclusion. Let's look at another example. So in this conditional statement, I'm stating if it's morning, then Mrs. Mulvey has a cup of coffee on her desk. In the original statement, the hypothesis would be it's morning. The conclusion would be Mrs. Mulvey has a cup of coffee on her desk. To write the converse of that, it would look like this. I would switch the hypothesis and the conclusion, so the converse becomes if Mrs. Mulvey has a cup of coffee on her desk, then it's morning. So the hypothesis became Mrs. Mulvey has a cup of coffee on her desk. The conclusion became it's morning. Hypothesis and conclusion were switched. That's a converse. And so now we reviewed identifying conditional statements, identifying parts of conditional statements, and stating the converse of conditional statements. In the next video, we're going to talk about the inverse and the contrapositive. But that's all for this video. Let me know if you have questions.